Margaret stood in the doorway of the ballroom, and the first thing anyone said to her was, "Kitchen," around back. She didn't correct them. She smoothed the same gray cardigan she'd worn to work every morning for 30 years and let the young man in the vest lead her to a folding chair near the swinging door. Her granddaughter's engagement dinner. The most important night of Chloe's life, and Margaret had been mistaken for the help before she'd said a single word to anyone in the room. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She said nothing. Because 3 hours earlier, before any of this began, Margaret had made a decision that not one person at that table had any idea was coming, and by the end of the night, they would understand exactly who had been sitting by that kitchen door the whole time. Diane Whitmore had been planning this dinner for 4 months. Every centerpiece, every seating card, every detail of the evening existed to prove one thing to the 70 guests she'd invited to the Ashford Grand, that her son Preston was marrying into a family worth knowing. She had asked about Chloe's grandmother more times than she could count. Preston always gave the same answer. "She's quiet. She keeps to herself. You'll meet her at the dinner." Diane accepted this the way she accepted most things that didn't fit her plans, by deciding in advance what she would find, and building a story around it before the woman had even walked through the door. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret Coyle was 71 years old. She had been widowed for 18 years, and she had raised her daughter Ellen alone after that, working double shifts as a hotel housekeeper in a 2-star roadside motel outside Macon, Georgia. When Ellen died of a stroke at 39, it was Margaret who raised Chloe from the age of 9, packing her lunches, driving her to school in a Buick with a cracked windshield, and working a job that most people in that ballroom would never have looked at twice. What none of them knew, because Margaret had never once volunteered it, was that somewhere between the motel and tonight, she had built something. It started with one property she scraped together a down payment for at 44. It did not stop there. Before any of it, before the properties and the holding company and the quiet fortune nobody at that table could have guessed at, Margaret had a supervisor named Odell who ran housekeeping at that Macon motel with the discipline of a woman who had raised 4 children on tips and overtime. Odell told her once, folding towels at 4 in the morning, that nobody in this business ever got to choose how people looked at them, only what they built while those people weren't looking. Margaret carried that sentence for 30 years the way other people carried scripture. She saved every spare dollar through Ellen's childhood, through night classes in hospitality management taken 2 evenings a week after a full shift, through a decade of telling herself that dignity and ambition were never supposed to be at war with each other, no matter how many people acted like they were. Margaret still wore the same 3 cardigans on rotation. She still drove a 12-year-old Buick with 210,000 miles on it, the same car that had carried Chloe to 100 piano recitals and a dozen hospital visits. She had never traded it in, not because she couldn't, but because it had never once let her down, and Margaret did not discard things that had earned her loyalty. Her name did not appear on any building. Her company operated under a holding name, Ashford Hospitality Partners, a name she'd chosen deliberately so that the work could speak instead of her face. Tonight, she had come to watch her granddaughter get engaged, wearing the same plain gray cardigan she wore to church, expecting nothing from this family except a seat at the table. The Ashford Grand sat on 11 acres of restored plantation land outside Savannah, ivy climbing the brick, chandeliers original to 1911, a ballroom that could seat 200 beneath a ceiling painted with magnolias. Guests believed it was owned by an old Savannah family that had held it for generations. That story had been true once. It had not been true for 6 years, since the family sold it quietly to a hospitality company that kept the staff, kept the name, kept the magnolias, and never once put its own name on the sign. Diane Whitmore had booked this venue specifically because it announced, without her having to say a word, that the Whitmores belonged among people who mattered. She had no idea that the woman she was about to seat by the kitchen door was the reason the building still stood at all. The dinner began at 7. Diane stood at the head of the table in a champagne-colored dress and introduced her guests one at a time, naming their titles, their firms, their connections to the Whitmore name. Judge Averill, Dr. Renata Cole, Bishop Harmon, who had baptized both of her children. Each guest received a warm word, a personal detail, a moment held up to the light. When she reached the far end of the table, where Margaret sat with her hands folded and her water glass noticeably smaller than everyone else's, Diane's eyes moved past her the way they might move past a coat rack. She did not skip her by accident. She skipped her because in Diane's mind, there was nothing there worth nomming. Sabrina, Preston's younger sister, drifted down to Margaret's end of the table 20 minutes later with a glass of wine and a question that wasn't really a question. "So you used to clean rooms or something?" Margaret looked at her, steady, unbothered, and said, "I worked in hospitality for a long time, yes." Sabrina smiled, the particular smile of someone who has already decided the conversation is over before it began, and said, "That's sweet," before drifting back to her friends, already laughing before she'd fully turned away. Margaret picked up her fork. She had been underestimated by people with far more polish than Sabrina Whitmore, and she had learned decades ago that a woman's worth was never something she needed to defend at a dinner table. It only ever needed proving once, and never to the people doing the underestimating. While Sabrina drifted back to her friends, she was already typing, angling her phone low against her lap so her mother wouldn't notice. She snapped a photo of Margaret from across the table, hands folded, cardigan buttoned to the collar, the swinging kitchen door framed behind her like a joke that told itself. The caption she posted to the Whitmore family group chat read, "Meet the grandma, thoughts and prayers to Preston." The replies came fast, a laughing emoji from a cousin in Charlotte, a comment from an aunt about how Chloe must be marrying up in every sense of the word. Sabrina read each one with the particular satisfaction of a woman certain she would never have to answer for any of it, certain that a folding chair by a kitchen door was the only place a woman like Margaret would ever sit. Richard Whitmore rose next, tall, gray at the temples, a developer who had spent 30 years building strip malls and calling them legacy projects. He spoke about the Whitmore name, about alignment, about surrounding yourself with people who reflect where you're going. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen door exactly once while he said it. The guests applauded, soft and practiced, the sound of people agreeing with something they hadn't examined closely. Margaret clapped twice and returned to her plate. She had sat through boardrooms that treated her with more contempt than this table ever could. Men who assumed a woman who counted linens for a living had nothing worth hearing, and she had outlasted every one of them without raising her voice a single time. Diane's cruelty sharpened as the wine did its work. She stood to discuss the cost of the evening, the flowers, the orchestra, the venue fee, and said, with a glance down the table, that everyone understood was not accidental, that she and Richard had carried the full weight of tonight's celebration, and that she understood not every family was positioned to contribute the same. A few guests laughed under their breath. Margaret set down her fork and said nothing. Then Diane reached for the small wrapped gift Margaret had brought for Chloe, a framed photograph from Chloe's college graduation, and held it up between two fingers as though deciding whether it deserved space on her table at all. "What is this?" she asked, already smiling at her own question. She opened it. The photograph inside showed Margaret and Chloe on graduation day, Margaret in her one good dress, Chloe in her cap and gown, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Diane looked at it for a moment too long, then set it down harder than necessary, hard enough that the glass cracked along one corner. A few guests exchanged glances. Chloe rose halfway out of her chair before catching herself. Margaret reached across the space between them and took her granddaughter's hand under the table, and with the smallest shake of her head, told her without a single word to sit back down. This was not the moment. Margaret had learned, in 30 years of being underestimated, exactly which moments mattered and which ones didn't, and this one was not it. Preston sat through all of it with his hands pressed flat against the tablecloth, watching his mother the way a man watches whether he has never once tried to stop. Chloe turned to him once, twice, waiting for the sentence that would fix any of it. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. Chloe understood, watching him fold under the weight of his own silence, that she was not looking at a nervous man having a bad night. She was looking at the rest of her life, laid out in a single, unspoken refusal to defend the people he claimed to love. She turned her engagement ring once around her finger, and for the first time all evening, she stopped turning it and let her hand go still in her lap. Margaret excused herself for a moment near the end of the second course. She walked to the small alcove near the coat check, took out her phone, and typed a short message to a name saved simply as Grant, the general manager who had run the Ashford Grand for 11 years and had never once in all that time seen the woman who owned it walk through the front door unannounced. The message read, "I'm here tonight. Table by the kitchen. No need to make a scene. Just wanted you to know." She hit send, slipped the phone back into her cardigan pocket, and returned to her seat without a word to anyone. She had not sent it to punish the Whitmores. She had sent it because, for the first time in a very long evening, she wanted someone in the building to know exactly who was sitting in that chair. The minutes after Margaret sent that message passed the way minutes always do at the end of a long evening, unnoticed by everyone except the one person waiting on them. Dessert arrived. A lemon tort nobody at Margaret's end of the table was offered until she asked for it directly. Diane resumed her story about the venue's provenance, embellishing details she'd half invented, certain that no one at her table knew enough about the building's history to correct her. Chloe sat with her hand still resting where her grandmother had touched it, watching the second hand move around her own wristwatch, though she couldn't have said why she was counting, only that something in the room had shifted the moment her grandmother stood up and walked toward the coat check, and had not shifted back since she returned to her seat. Grant read the message standing at the front desk, and the color left his face in the space of a single breath. He had spoken to Margaret Coyle exactly 4 times in 11 years, always by phone, always brief, always about something structural, a roof, a renovation budget, nothing more. He had never once imagined she would walk into his ballroom in a cardigan and sit unnoticed for 2 hours. He set down the reservation binder, gathered himself for exactly the amount of time it took to smooth his jacket, and walked toward the grand terrace with the quiet urgency of a man who understood, better than anyone else in the building that night, precisely how badly this evening had already gone wrong for the family hosting it. Back at the table, Diane was mid-sentence, telling a story about the venue's history, about how her family had known the previous owners personally, about how a place like this simply could not be bought by just anyone. She was still speaking when Grant appeared at the edge of the room, flanked by 2 members of his senior staff, and walked the length of the ballroom directly toward the chair by the kitchen door. The string quartet faltered. A few guests turned. Grant stopped in front of Margaret, extended both hands to help her rise, and said, loud enough for the nearest third of the table to hear, "Mrs. Coyle, I am so sorry. I had no idea you were joining us tonight. Is there anything at all we can do to make this right?" Diane's voice caught mid-sentence and did not finish. "Mrs. Coyle," she repeated, as though testing whether the syllables might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Grant turned toward her with the practiced calm of a man who had spent 11 years managing difficult rooms, and said, "Margaret Coyle owns the Ashford Grand, ma'am, along with 11 other properties across 3 states, through Ashford Hospitality Partners. She's owned this building for 6 years. Every member of this staff answers to her." The room went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when 70 people realize, all at once, that they have been watching the wrong person the entire evening, and that the woman by the kitchen door had been the only one in it with nothing left to prove. Diane's hand found the back of her chair. Richard set down his glass so carefully it made no sound at all, which somehow felt louder than if he dropped it. Sabrina looked up from her phone, the smirk draining slowly off her face, as she did the math on every word she'd said in the last 2 hours. Margaret rose from her chair without hurry, smoothed her cardigan the way she had at the door 3 hours earlier, and said nothing at all for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became the only sound in the room. Then she looked at Diane, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the same steady patience she had carried through 30 years of being underestimated by people who mistook quiet for small. "You asked me earlier what I used to do," Margaret said, and her voice did not rise, did not need to. "I told you I worked in hospitality. That was true the whole time. I scrubbed toilets in a 2-star motel outside Macon for 11 years to keep my daughter fed, and I have never once been ashamed of that work. I bought my first building the year my granddaughter turned 9, because I needed somewhere steady to raise her, and I built the rest one property at a time, the same way I built everything else in my life, without asking anyone in a room like this for permission. You didn't skip me tonight because you knew who I was. You skipped me because you decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth." Chloe stood then, slowly, the way a person stands when a decision has finally settled somewhere past the reach of anger. 3 hours, she said, looking around the table at faces that had laughed, had smirked, had said nothing while her grandmother sat by a kitchen door being quietly erased from her own family's evening. 3 hours, and every single one of you decided she didn't matter, right up until you found out what she owns. She turned to Preston, who was staring at the tablecloth the way he had been staring at it for the better part of the night, and said, "And you sat here the entire time and never said a word. Not for me. Not for her." She slid the ring from her finger and set it on the table in front of him, and this time, nobody in the room mistook the gesture for anything but final. The video reached the internet 9 days later, filmed quietly by a guest near the back of the room who had watched the entire evening without laughing once, and who had spent a week deciding whether what he'd witnessed was his to share. It crossed 4 million views in 72 hours, then 12, then 30, carried by a single caption that read, "She owned the building the whole time, and they still made her sit by the kitchen." Local news in Savannah picked it up within a week. A national morning show followed with a segment on quiet wealth and the assumptions people make about older women in modest clothing. The comment sections filled with stories from women who recognized themselves in that folding chair, women who had spent decades being underestimated in exam rooms and boardrooms and dinner tables just like this one, and who finally saw someone like them refuse to shrink. Diane's calendar emptied within a month. The charity board she'd built her reputation on quietly declined to renew her seat. Richard's development firm, which had leaned on Ashford Hospitality Partners for 2 long-term construction contracts, received formal notice that both agreements would not be extended past their current term, a decision made not out of spite, but out of the simple fact that Margaret no longer wished to do business with people who had treated her the way this family had. Diane hired a communications consultant out of Atlanta within the week, and together they produced a short apology video, filmed in soft natural light at her kitchen table, no jewelry, a cardigan of her own chosen deliberately for the camera. She read from a script that used words like reflection and growth and painful lesson, and posted it the following Friday, hoping the internet would accept the performance in place of the years that had built it. It did not. Viewers who had watched the original video 11 and 12 times noticed everything the consultant hadn't accounted for: the practiced pause before the word sorry, the cardigan that matched Margaret's a little too closely to be accidental. The apology video collected more commentary than the original clip had in its first day, nearly all of it pointing out the same conclusion. She wasn't sorry for the room. She was sorry the room had been recorded. Sabrina locked every account she owned within days of the video crossing 10 million views, her own words captured in the footage, time-stamped, impossible to walk back. Preston wrote Chloe 3 letters in as many months. She read the first one. The other 2 stayed sealed in a drawer she rarely opened, a decision she never once second-guessed. 6 months later, Margaret sat on the porch of the small brick house she had lived in for over 20 years, The same house she'd bought outright the year Ellen died, long before any of the properties, long before any of it. The Buick sat in the driveway where it always sat, dust settled evenly across the hood. She could have parked something else there. She never once considered it worth the trouble. Chloe climbed the porch steps carrying 2 mugs of coffee, black for her grandmother, cream for herself, and sat down in the chair beside her the way she had sat there every Sunday since she was 9 years old. She looked lighter than she had in months, the particular lightness of someone who has finally stopped carrying something that was never hers to hold. "I got the residency," Chloe said, and Margaret's whole face changed the way it only ever changed for her granddaughter. "Your mother would have called every single person she knew," Margaret said, and Chloe laughed because it was true, and because for the first time since that dinner, laughing about her mother didn't feel like grief, it felt like memory. They sat together as the light went gold over the yard, and Margaret thought, not for the first time, about the motel room she'd cleaned for 11 years, and the woman who trained her there, who told her once that nobody gets to decide your worth by the size of your water glass, only by what you're still standing on when the room finally sees you clearly. No one should ever have to own a building to be treated like she belongs in the room. Margaret didn't reveal who she was that night to win anything. She revealed it because the truth was simply due, and because a granddaughter she loved deserved to watch someone stand up straight instead of small. The people who only respected her once they learned what she owned never respected her at all. They respected the number attached to her name, and the moment that number disappeared, so would they have. That is not respect. That is a transaction wearing a nice dress. If you have ever sat in a room where people decided who you were before you said a single word, tell us about it in the comments below. And if this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet dignity outlasts every room that ever underestimated it.